And I don't think there's anything in orthopedics, especially in pediatric orthopedics, which has changed so radically over the last 20 years as the way we treat clubfoot. I remember the first 5 years of my practice, when we began, we were doing almost 150 to 200 soft tissue surgeries per year. And within the span of a year, once we introduced the Ponseti method all throughout India from 2003 onwards, the rates of radical surgery dropped so drastically that's almost amazing to see. So what I'll cover here today is how do we manage relapse, and because the Ponseti method is the most important technique that we're using, I'll focus much more on how do we deal with the relapse following the Ponseti method. So if you read the literature, you'll realize that most of the relapses, in fact almost 2/3 of them, occur in the first 2 years of life, and that's what Ponseti has shown from his very long-term studies. But of course, even up to the age of 5, there is a chance for relapse. So he has shown that 1/3 of relapses occur even up to the age of 5 years. If you read the various Ponseti publications that have come about since 1963, the initial results of Ponseti showed a very high recurrence rate of almost 56%. And that's the reason why this method did not become very popular for the first 20 or 30 years after Ponseti established it, because though he had a correction in almost 90% of cases, if half of them recurred, people were not so keen on this particular technique. If you realize, I think the first thing to understand is how to define a relapse or a recurrence. And that's something that many authors struggle with. I think the best definition would be that if you have a reappearance of even one or more components of the cave deformity, that is cavus, adductus, varus, or equinus, that requires further treatment, that would be the definition of a relapse. So there is a subjective element to this definition, no doubt, but minor degrees of reappearance of a deformity, especially things like midfoot abduction, a forefoot adduction, or a mild amount of cavus, can be easily ignored if it does not cause any functional or major cosmetic problems. We must understand that recurrences of two types, and they may coexist together. It could be either static or dynamic. And there are various ways in which you assess a recurrence. One way is to use the Piranha or the Demeglio scores. They were actually used initially to define the severity of a deformity, but we could use these scores as a surrogate for relapse as well. This is an excellent article that came out from Matthew Dobbs in 2004, which said, what are the main reasons for why a recurrence occurs? And he has shown that the three main or four main causes are the failure to gain full abduction during the correction phase of the deformity, failure to use the foot abduction brace, an overactive tibialis anterior causing a dynamic supination deformity, and a basic growth spurt that happens in children. And there is a small percentage of cases where the cause really is not known. Now, the early recurrence of a deformity recurrence in the Ponseti method, if you look at the various causes that Dobbs enumerated, the two main causes are these. And it's interesting to note it took Ponseti several decades to understand that these are the two important causes for a relapse. The first is the failure to achieve 70 degrees of abduction in the last cast. And that's especially true for young babies who are less than 1 year of age. This is not, of course, true if you're treating older children who have less supple deformities. And the second is non-compliance with brace wear. This is an interesting study that came out of Ponseti's own institute. He looked at the first 35 years of applying his method, and where he did not use that abduction up to 70 degrees, he found that the incidence of recurrence was as high as 48 to 50% in the first 2 years of life. But the minute in the next series of patients over the next 10 years, where he started using 70 degrees of abduction in the last plaster, it dropped drastically from 50% to 15%. And that's a very radical drop in recurrence rates for a simple technique of abducting up to 70 degrees in the last plaster. The second important reason for a recurrence, of course, is non-compliance with brace wear. And there are various studies which have looked into that, as I've quoted again, Dobbs' study which showed, and Ponseti studies which show that if you're compliant with brace wear, the risk of relapse is very less. Whereas if you don't comply, you have a very high risk of recurrence just because of this one entity, which is failure to use the brace. Here's a study from New Zealand which showed that when looking at 51 children with 73 club feet over a minimum period of 2 years, defining recurrence as one requiring either a minimum surgery or a major recurrence as one which required a full-blown surgical approach. Hamish Crawford found that 40% of the patients had a recurrence, and only half of these had complied with the bracing protocol. So what he and further people have shown that if you don't comply with the bracing protocol, you have a 5 times higher chance of developing a recurrence. And interestingly, there's no significant relationship of recurrence with severity of presentation, the time at which you start the casting, the number of casts that you apply, or your ethnicity or family history. So the two main factors for recurrence are the failure to achieve 70 degrees of abduction in the last plaster and non-compliance with the bracing protocol. How does one recognize a relapse? I think we use our standard methods of look, feel, and move. And therefore, the first step is to look how the child is standing, walking, and squatting. I think squatting is a very important method to diagnose early relapse of equinus. That's something that's inherent in our Indian population, that people, especially in rural areas, require to squat. And unless you have at least 30 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion, you're unable to squat. You'll have an early heel rise. And that's the first way to diagnose an early recurrence of equinus deformity. The second, of course, is an active measurement by actively trying to measure the extent of dorsiflexion. Another good method is to stroke the sole of the foot and to look for the presence of a dynamic supination. And of course, as I mentioned, you can use the Pirani or the DiMeglio scores as surrogates for relapse, but of course, they have not been validated for that. But it's been described that if you have a Pirani score of 1 or more, or a DiMeglio score of 5 or more, then that's an indication of a relapse. So here you can see a 2-year-old child who has treatise dysplasia. You can see on both sides he has constriction rings. He's got a minor amputation of the toe on the left side. And as he's walking, you can notice that he has this recurrence of a deformity. It's a combination of static and dynamic both, because as the foot is swinging, you'll realize that there is a dynamic supination of the foot. But even in the stance phase, there's presence of some amount of forefoot adduction and the presence of a heel varus. So here's a combination of a static and a dynamic supination. Now, how does one deal with this at the age of 2 years? Just to bring to your attention, this child was treated at birth with 5 serial plasters and a tendoachilles stenotomy. He was not compliant with brace wear. So at this young age, the importance is that recognition is crucial. A lot of us try to bury our head below the sand and pretend as if it does not exist. But Ponseti has very clearly said that the more you ignore a relapse, the worse it becomes. We must be able to convince the parents that there is an early relapse, and even if the foot is correctable passively, we must begin the treatment early. The recognition, as I've already shown you, is loss of dorsiflexion or an early heel rise, the onset of heel varus or weight bearing on the lateral border of the foot, an onset of midfoot adductus, and as I've said, the child may have a dynamic supination as well. So at this age, we go back again to the Ponseti method. It worked in the initial phase, it will work again now. And it's important to convince the parents that this is not a failure of treatment. Despite our best efforts, a child who's treated with the Ponseti method will have a risk of relapse. And I think the best way to counsel the parents is at the time of instituting the brace wear itself, to tell them that despite the best efforts, the chance of relapse is present. If you wear the brace, the relapse rate is low. If you do not wear the brace, you have a very high relapse rate. But if it does recur, we can always treat it back again with the same technique that we used at birth. So here, go back again to the Ponseti casting. The good thing is here, if you pick it up early, within 2 or 3 plasters, you can correct the foot again. Do not hesitate to repeat a tendoachilles stenotomy if you find the dorsiflexion up to 15 degrees is not possible. And then go back again and reinstitute your bracing protocol. And this time, try and ensure as much compliance as possible. What I would not do is a tibialis anterior tendon transfer. In fact, the worst results of a tibialis anterior tendon transfer are when it's done in a child who's less than 2.5 years old. And there have been several studies from literature which have shown that. So if you have a younger child who has a dynamic supination, try and correct that with the Ponseti plasters. Try and use the brace as much as possible, but defer your tendon transfer till at least 2.5 and ideally till the age of 3. So that brings us to dynamic supination. And Atul has already touched upon some part of it. It occurs because, as we said, of a tibialis anterior which is overactive. It can be subtle to diagnose. But the key way of diagnosing it is during the swing phase of gait, when you find the foot goes into dynamic supination. and the child strikes the foot on the lateral border during the stance phase. So here's an example of a 3.5-year-old boy. As you can see, statically the foot is placed well. But once he goes into swing, the foot turns inwards, and you can see he lands up on the lateral border of the foot. And this is the typical presentation of a dynamic supination. This should not be missed. It's very easy to pick it up on a video like this. And I encourage all of you to use your slow motion videos on your smartphones. Every smartphone since the last 3 years or so have a slow motion facility, and that picks up dynamic supination really well without the need for any fancy gait analysis or other things. So how do you manage a child in this age group? From 2 to 5 years, remember that if you have a static deformity, you must correct that first. You cannot do a tendon transfer in the presence of a static deformity. So whatever residual static deformity must be corrected with Ponseti plasters. Usually 2 to 5 plasters may be required. Again, if the equinus does not permit a dorsiflexion to at least 10 degrees, repeat the tendoachilles tenotomy. Some of these children have a residual cavus. You might be able to correct that with the Ponseti plasters, but occasionally you might need to do a plantar fascia release. And once the static deformity has been corrected, that's when you should go ahead with the tibialis anterior tendon transfer. You always do a complete transfer of the tendon from the navicular and the first metatarsal to the lateral cuneiform, and then cast the child for 4 to 6 weeks, depending upon the age of the child. So this is a fairly old technique. It's not something new. It was described, in fact, in the 1940s, and it's often called the Garceau technique because he was the first one to report the results of a tibialis anterior tendon transfer. And in his technique, he used a 3-incision approach. I'll show you some quick pictures of how the technique, or what technique we actually follow for doing the tendoachilles, for doing the tibialis anterior tendon transfer. We follow the 2-incision technique that has been described by Ponseti, which is a modification of the Garceau technique. You don't need to have a 3rd incision over the front of the leg, but 1 incision over the medial aspect of the origin of the tibialis anterior tendon, and 1 over the lateral most cuneiform, where you're going to reinsert the new tendon. So your first incision is, as I've said, identify the tibialis anterior tendon, trace it all the way down to its insertion onto the base of the first metatarsal and the navicular so that you get enough length of the tendon, and then detach it completely from its insertion, as you can see down there. Then you have to release a little bit of the tendon sheath as you go proximally. If you do not do that, you will have a tendon which has an oblique line of transfer. You know, one of the principles of tendon transfer is to have a straight line of pull. So we must be careful not to release the extensor retinaculum on the dorsum of the ankle, because this will cause a bowstringing, which is very unsightly. Release just enough of the tendon sheath so that when you transfer the tendon, you have a straight line of pull. Then you can take a modified bunnel or a whip stitch through the tendon, which all of us are quite used to while doing tendon transfers. The next step is to identify the lateral cuneiform, and ideally if you have a C-arm or an X-ray, it's very easy to do that. So in line with the 3rd metatarsal, which is the axis of the foot, you'll find that's where you have the lateral cuneiform. You should never transfer the whole tendon to the cuboid, because that can cause a very severe valgus deformity, which is far more disabling than an adduction deformity. So the ideal bone to transfer it to is, as you can see, medial, middle, and the lateral cuneiform, and that's which is in line with the axis of the midfoot, and that's where you should be going. Take your incision over the dorsum. You require hardly a 2 centimeter incision. Separate out the extensor digitorum brevis muscle, and then you have the long extensor tendons of the toes, which should be kept to one side carefully, and then you're straight down onto the 3rd cuneiform. Elevate the periosteum over it and identify the bone, and then make a small drill hole, as you can see here, through the lateral cuneiform, going in a straight perpendicular to the direction of the foot. Be careful as you exit out from the sole of the foot, because you have the medial and lateral plantar nerves and vessels. So be very careful when you exit out with your drill. As soon as you give the give way through the bone, you stop your drill. And then I use a straight hemostat to widen and round that hole up in the lateral cuneiform. That helps the tendon to glide in really easily. So you must have a big enough hole. And I've seen commonly people struggle trying to put the tendon through that hole if you don't widen it enough. The tendon itself is about 2 to 3 and sometimes even 5 millimeters in thickness, and unless you make a good enough hole in the bone, the tendon will not glide through and will just sit at the edge of the bone and not adhere to it properly once it heals. So the next step is through that second incision, deliver the tendon from the first one. And this is the time to be sure that there is no facial coverings or tendon sheets, which is preventing a straight line of pull. If there is anything which interferes with that, you must release a bit of the tendon sheets, but do not release the extensor retinaculum. Otherwise, that will cause a bowstringing of the tendon. And once you've done that, you put you do a pull-out suture into the sole using a straight needle. Again, be careful here because you have the medial and lateral plantar nerves and vessels. So be very careful. The center of the foot is the safest part because the nerve has already divided and gone on either side, and so the vessel. And then you can tie it over a foam or a gauze. Uh, I would never use a button directly on the skin because that can cause a severe amount of skin necrosis. If you're using a button, you can use it over a gauze or over a piece of foam and tie it off like this. And it's important that when you finish the procedure, the foot can still drop down into some amount of plantar flexion. Do not tighten the tendon in a severe amount of dorsiflexion because that will cause a dorsiflexion contracture. So once you finish with the tightening and the closure, the foot must be able to fall or drop down by 10 to 15 degrees to ensure that you're not over tightened the tibialis anterior. And then you cast this for about 4 to 6 weeks. And according to Ponseti, there's no need for a bracing after this. We are more on the cautious side. And I would still institute bracing for at least a year after you have done the tibialis anterior tendon transfer, at least in the night time. So here are some long-term results from Ponseti's own institute. Really long-term results of tibialis anterior tendon transfer with a follow-up of 37 to 55 years. And they looked at the initial series treated by Ponseti from 1950 to 1967. They did a very detailed examination of the of clinical aspects, radiographic evaluation, pedobiographic analysis, and EMG as well. And they found that this surgery is very effective in preventing a long-term in preventing additional relapse and getting a long-term good function. Of course, you must remember that even after this, there is a small chance of a relapse. In fact, again, Jose Morcande has shown that there's a 15% chance of a relapse even after tibialis anterior tendon transfer. So don't be too complacent after this. A small percentage of patients have neuromuscular deficits. And as Atul rightly pointed out, if they don't have a fanning out of the toes and good everter activity, these are children who have some subclinical neuromuscular deficits and who have a higher chance of relapse. So be watchful right throughout childhood, especially in the first 5 years. So here are some other factors predictive of secondary recurrence after the tibialis anterior tendon transfer. Again, it has been shown that if you do the transfer before the age of 2.5 years, you have almost twice an amount of recurrence than if you do it after that. So therefore, my recommendation is that delay the transfer to ideally between the ages of 3 and 5, where you have the best chance of success. So the take-home messages is that the relapses are part of the Ponseti method of casting. We must explain this to the parents right up a priori before we start the treatment itself, so they are aware of the importance of bracing. We know that achieving that 70 degrees of abduction in the last plaster, especially if you have a child who's less than 1 year of age, and the important adherence to the brace compliance are the key to preventing early relapses. The good news is that most of these relapses are supple. They are amenable to casting, tenotomy, and bracing. And occasionally, if you have a dynamic supination, you might need to do a tendon transfer. Be careful that we are vigilant for relapses, at least till the age of 5 years. But every clubfoot should be followed up entirely till skeletal maturity. Thank you very much for your attention.